I believe and have participated in peaceful protests that were full of anger and frustration at the issues we wanted to change, fix, or to see taken serious by the government. That is not what is happening across this country. And I also, Madam Speaker, do not believe that it is over. We saw an occupation that became a complete undermining of our democracy and our social structures. The leaders of this occupation had an MOU that spoke about overtaking the government. They invited opposition parties and the Governor General to come have a discussion about how a new government would look. I will not minimize this. I simply will not. I may not agree with many components of the processes of our institutions. I believe, in fact, that there's a lot of work to do to decolonize our systems, to address key issues like systemic racism, ableism, white privilege, and how these institutions continuously leave out workers, the poor, persons with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ2+ communities, and people from the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Even with that perspective, I will not minimize that what it does when people, to our communities, when people do not respect the rule of law, when they flaunt their complete disregard for what a peaceful protest is, and when they create a party on the street that does not respect the people who live where they are occupying. Just yesterday, when I was trying to walk to this place, I saw a business owner chasing two men out of his store with a stick. It was frightening, and as I watched, I was trying to think of what I could do to help. But I also thought to myself, this is what happens when people disrespect the rule of law. When they set up bouncy councils and hot tubs in the streets and say, look how peaceful we are. People become emboldened to do actions that our social structures often prevent. So I will not minimize the fact that the lead organizers of this occupation are from groups of extremists who follow very clearly the beliefs of white supremacy. I believe there were many people out there who wanted to speak out about mandates and about their fear of the unknown and their future. However, I also know that the leaders were very clear about their agenda. Madam Speaker, this agenda scares me. I will not minimize it by saying there are just a few bad apples. I believe these people to be very organized. I believe that they take advantage of people's fear and give people someone to blame with those fears. This is where all of us as parliamentarians must look at history. Humanity sadly has a history of dehumanizing people from the communities I mentioned earlier. It is these people, these souls, who often pay the most terrible of prices. So I will not minimize the power of white supremacists and their ability to build fear. And I will not minimize that that fear can become a weapon. The NDP has used every tool at its disposal to get the federal government to act. We called for a debate specifically on the occupation. We moved a motion in committee to study the measures to keep money coming from outside of our country to fund this occupation and make sure that those dollars are all held to account. We moved a motion to invite the U.S. ambassador to the Foreign Affairs Committee to address concerns of the prominent U.S. political figures encouraging people to donate and support the convoy leaders. This was voted down by the Conservatives and the Liberals, with the Liberal member from Vancouver Centre saying, this is not an urgent issue. We have too many more urgent things, and I will definitely be voting against it. Well, Madam Speaker, I simply disagree. I cannot imagine any other issue right now that is more urgent. So now here we are. We're debating the Emergencies Act, and I wish that all levels of government had worked together more efficiently, that members of all levels of government had not minimized who is coming to our nation's front door. Governing in whatever capacity a person has is not easy. I personally struggle often over the decisions that I have to make in this place. This one has been very hard, and it should be. There are steps that all parliamentarians should be careful when we take. I wish I had heard a lot more of a thoughtful debate in this place. Sadly, there's been a lot of political shots taken, ones that further destabilize our democracy and our communities. On one side, we see the government who is dismissing legitimate fears and concerns from people who are afraid. On the official opposition side, we have people who are stirring up fears and amping up dangerous rhetoric. I will be voting yes. I will continue to take my duty seriously and with great possibility be ready to withdraw my support at any moment. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Comments? The honourable member for Lac Saint Louis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What an amazing speech. I have two questions for the honourable member. There's been a lot of talk about division, but I'd be interested in knowing or hearing her comments on the role of disinformation in stoking division, and also her opinion on this naive suggestion that if only the Prime Minister had sat down and had a cup of coffee with the leaders of the convoy, that somehow everyone would go home happy.
The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Madam Speaker, I am very concerned about disinformation. We're seeing a breadth of that grow. And that's why it's so important that we all support the people who do this incredible work, our media and our journalists. They go out there and they ask the hard questions. They want to report the information. So seeing people disrespect them, not respect the roles that they play, is very concerning to me. And we need to be looking at where that disinformation is coming from and making sure we're holding those systems to account. That has to be way more rigorous in this country, and we should all be seriously concerned about it. As for sitting down with extremists, I couldn't agree more. But I do want to say that I do believe that this government needs to listen to the people in this country who have very strong voices of concern, and that should be recognized and listened to and addressed in a respectful manner. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable for Peterborough-Kawartha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague for your speech. I can feel your passion. It's a lot of stress for those who are watching at home, and it's the same inside this chamber. This morning I walked to the House of Commons at 6:45 a.m. Wellington Street is completely cleared, and I'm just wondering if the member opposite is interested in revoking the Emergencies Act if they're still not there. And I want to ask specifically, today in a press conference when the Prime Minister spoke at 11 a.m., the CBC asked the Prime Minister would he hold on to power for 2 to 3 months in case the truckers came back, and the Prime Minister said, indeed, that is what we are thinking about. Does she agree with this abuse of power?
The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Well, Madam Speaker, I think the committee that oversees this needs to be set up immediately. I believe there needs to be a public inquiry in so many ways. We have to look at what happened when the people arrived, how the RCMP the police, sorry, I'm from BC and I have RCMP in my community, but how the police reacted and what was appropriate. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I will say very clearly to this member, if this government oversteps in any way the key things that we have identified that need to be addressed, we will definitely revoke it. 20 members have to do that work, and I think all of us have to hold them accountable, and not only the parliamentarians in this chamber, but all Canadians, and I will be a part of that. Thank you.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I listened to my colleague's speech earlier, and there were a few interesting elements. I don't have time to speak to all of the speech because I have to give my question quickly, but there's an element that stood out to me. Among all of the arguments that she put forward in favor of the Emergencies Act, I asked myself the question, if I were in her shoes, how is it that today, in 2022, the government decided to use the Emergencies Act? Because when we look at all of the previous years, over the past 30 years, how many times has this act been used? How many crises have there been that have been resolved without the Emergencies Act? So why is it that this time, with this crisis, it's so much bigger than all the other crises, and that this Emergencies Act is absolutely necessary this time, and it wouldn't have been possible without it?
For North Island Powell River has just under a minute to respond.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for this thoughtful question, and I think we should all be looking into this and why we are where we are today. And I do lay that at multiple levels of government in this province and within this country. I would have liked to see a much more coordinated approach. Again, people were driving across the country with very clear intent of what they were going to do, and their response when they arrived here was, here's the doors open, park and do as you will. But when we get to a situation where the community is not safe, where we know that people are at risk, when we know foreign money is interfering in our democracy, unfortunately, we have to stand up. And now we'll have to monitor this very closely, and I look forward to doing so.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased today to have the opportunity to participate in this historic debate. I'll be sharing my time, Madam Speaker, with the member for Beaches East York. Today, Madam Speaker, it's been 3 weeks that we've seen protesters, encouraged at times by the Conservative Party, amplified by some extremists on social networks who seem to be funded in part by foreign money. They arrived in Ottawa to start an illegal occupation of our national capital.
Then spread to the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, to the Coutts border crossing in Alberta, and to other points across our nation. From that, we have seen supply chains disrupted, businesses shut down, workers forced to stay home, and Canadians harassed in their home neighborhoods. Madam Speaker, these blockades and occupations are illegal. They represent a threat to our economy, to our communities, to relationships with our key trading partners, and to our international reputation. Images of these illegal blockades are being broadcast around the world. Images that are not representative of Canada, but are now impacting our global reputation. The blockades have massively impacted our supply chains and the availability of essential goods, and are putting at risk Canada's long-term economic prosperity. They've threatened our public safety, Madam Speaker, and they're an affront to something all members in this House should dearly appreciate: the rule of law. This cannot and will not be allowed to stand in our country. Madame la Présidente, en tant que
Madam Speaker, as Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, I want our economic recovery post-COVID to be dynamic and sustainable. I know that we are well positioned to prosper thanks to our resources, our talent, and our ingenuity, but also thanks to our stability, our trade relationships, and our respect for the rule of law.
concerning that at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, billions of dollars in goods did not cross the border when the illegal blockades took place. The blockades in Coutts in Alberta and in Emerson in Manitoba, meanwhile, have affected approximately 48 million and 73 million in trade each day, respectively. The situation here in Ottawa is of concern, Madam Speaker. We've all seen it. Downtown businesses have been forced to close, putting people out of work. The Rideau Centre Mall, Madam Speaker, that we all know, and the businesses operating in it, just down the street from Parliament, is currently losing $3 million in business per day because it was forced to close due to harassments of staff and illegal actions from occupiers. These costs, Madam Speaker, are real. They threaten business, big and small, and they threaten the livelihoods of Canadian workers. En tant que l'une des principales
As one of the main economies in the world, Canada counts on solid supply chains to sustain our economy. However, their global nature makes them more vulnerable to a series of risks and shocks. And with the impacts of the pandemic, as we all know, supply chains in the world have already felt unprecedented pressure.
COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in disruptions in production and in shipping. We've seen it. Companies across the world are experiencing demand uncertainty, supply and logistical delays, and significant operations stoppage. The blockades and protests have added to the already heavy burden that Canadian businesses across our nation and citizens have been asked to manage during this pandemic. We cannot allow, Madam Speaker, illegal blockades to hijack Canada's economic recovery and endanger the livelihoods of Canadian workers. And I think that should be appreciated by all members in this House. J'aimerais rappeler aux députés de la
I'd like to remind the members of the House of some of the devastating effects of these blockades as we debate the ratification of the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
That the auto sector manufacturers like GM, Stellantis, Honda, and Ford have had to either reduce or completely suspend manufacturing last week as a result of the Sarnia and Windsor trade corridor blockades. That should be of concerns to all members of this House, Madam Speaker. I can also point out to Douglas Porter, which is the chief economist at BMO. He stated that for every week the protests continue, it could start to cut first quarter growth by up to a couple of tenths of a percent. Madam Speaker, that should be of concern to all members of this House. As we continue to reopen our economy and come out on the other side of the Omicron wave, any reversal of our economic fortunes is an unnecessary blow to business owners and Canadians who have already been through so much during this pandemic. And I know every member of this House is concerned about the recovery, but we should all do what is right, Madam Speaker, and make sure that there's no more illegal blockades in this country. The impact of these illegal blockades goes well beyond our borders, sadly. Canada has no closer friend and ally than the United States of America. It is a partnership which is based on our forged geography, common interest, and a deep people-to-people connections and strong and secure economic ties, Madam Speaker. It's a relationship we defended and protected when we renegotiated CUSMA, despite pleas from the Conservative Party for us to fold and capitulate. And it's one that we are defending here today together.
During recent conversations with my international counterparts and with stakeholders from the private sector, it is clear that we recognize that the United States, along with the United States, the importance of our integrated supply chains, and that we must work together to ensure the free flow of goods between our two markets.
For these reasons, Madam Speaker, and others, that our government took the unprecedented but necessary step in invoking the Emergencies Act to restore public order and to protect our economic well-being. This is not a decision that we will be taking lightly, nor it is one that we ever wanted to make. But it is a step that is needed in order to give law enforcement authorities the tools they need to face this very unique situation in our country. These measures are reasonable and proportionate. Canadians at large agree because they are looking to us to ensure predictability and the rule of law, protect supply chains, and restoring our economic vitality. Goldie Hyder of the Business Council of Canada, for example, said that we welcome this as a step towards ending illegal blockades across the country and upholding the rule of law. Piran Beatty of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, to cite one more example, said that the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act indicates how serious the threat to public safety and our economy from the ongoing blockades at various points in Canada has become. In conclusion, Madam Speaker, I'd remind colleagues in the Conservative bench that it was in fact Piran Beatty who first introduced the Emergencies Act in 1988 as the Minister of National Defense for the then Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, perhaps the party that once portrayed itself as the defender of law and order and as a champion of the free market should re-examine how they are standing today. We know we're standing with on this side of the House. We're standing with workers at the Stellantis Windsor assembly plant who had their shifts cut due to supply chain blockages. We're standing with small businesses owners like those of Mocho Ice Cream and the local coffee shop Little Victories in Ottawa, who've had to close their door due to safety concerns. We're standing with the Canadian truckers who did their job and kept our shelves and our warehouses stocked during this pandemic. Madam Speaker, we're standing with Canadians who want these illegal blockades to end, and with the support of the House today's motion, they will. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thomas, the honourable member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a very simple question for the Minister. He's talking about the still ongoing illegal blockades. So could he just provide one instance in Canada ongoing right now of a current illegal blockade and why the Emergencies Act is still required going forward? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for the question. And I think that the colleague would agree after everything we've said, after everything we've seen, Madam Speaker, in terms of violence and intimidation, that the way to act in light of this, Madam Speaker, is to be prudent, is to make sure that as the situation is fluid, that we give law enforcement authorities all the powers they need to make sure that not only we clear the different crossings that we have seen blocked in Canada, but that the law enforcement authorities would have all the powers needed to keep these trade corridors open. I'm sure my colleague understands he has business in his riding, and I'm sure he would understand that we need to make sure that our supply chain remain open at this critical point in our recovery.
The Honourable Member for Mirabel. Thank you, Madam Speaker. In the debate over the past few days, what I've seen, Liberal members have said that the Emergencies Act was necessary so that law enforcement from Quebec could rescue Ottawa. But over the past 2 days, I have learned, well, this may be false. It may be enough to just oblige them like we've already done. If the Emergencies Act was so necessary, and if democratic, why did the members' caucus mislead this House? The Honourable Minister. Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for this question, but I think in a debate like this one, we have to choose our words very carefully. I think we have to calm citizens, and I would tell my colleague that he could refer to a letter written by various law enforcement officials in this country, said that they have said that this Emergencies Act is necessary so that they have the necessary powers to deal with this unprecedented situation in Canada's history. And I think, Madam Speaker, we all want to return to peace and order across the country, and I believe that this act will help us to stabilize the situation.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Bloc and Conservatives keep giving the impression things are fine at the Ambassador Bridge, and I can tell you the barriers are lined up for miles on my constituency to prevent further action. In fact, since the Emergency Measures Act has been in place, convoys have been turned back, and there still are threats that could take place. I want the minister to explain the consequences that would be in place for Ontario and also Quebec MPs should this route be choked off, and how irresponsible it is to go back to having just the municipal police force right now take care of this international border crossing area, which is responsible for 40% of our daily trade. It's totally irresponsible to put that on local municipalities, and I can't understand why Ontario and Quebec MPs would want to put that entirely on our onus, and the danger is still around.
L'Honorable Ministre.
The Honourable Minister.
I think the member said it well. 30% of all trade between Canada and the United States is using that crossing of the Ambassador Bridge. As the member said, it's not only one thing to maintain the bridge open, but as I've been reassuring our colleagues on both sides of the border, what we need to make sure now is that we maintain that crossing open, Madam Speaker. It is one thing for once to be blocked, but it would be devastating for the Canadian economy if there would be new blockades on that very critical infrastructure. That's why the Emergencies Act will give the power, as the member said, not only to the local enforcement authority, but that they could rely on other forces around the country to make sure that we would restore order. Madam Speaker, we should all be concerned of maintaining our critical trading corridors open in order to preserve jobs, to make sure that our economy would function, and to make sure that we would be seen and remain a very reliable trading partner.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Beaches East York. I'm sorry, the Honourable Member has to put his mic on in order to be heard. That would help a lot because not every one of us is able to read lips. The Honourable Member.
Madam Speaker, the question before us is whether we ought to confirm the government's declaration of an emergency pursuant to Section 58 of the Emergencies Act. I've really struggled with the answer to that question, and I'll get to that. But the first question we should all reflect on is a more basic one. How did it even come to this? Some Conservative colleagues have made the case that we could have ended the illegal blockades if only we ended federal vaccine mandates, a Neville Chamberlain approach to pandemic management. Appeasing illegality is an affront to the rule of law, and we should put public health before politics. Mandates won't be with us forever, and yes, we need to reevaluate their use. But it's also true that NACI has yet to confirm whether a third dose is properly a booster dose or should be considered part of the primary series. And we should proceed cautiously as we lift measures that have helped to save lives. Of course, people are tired of pandemic rules. I was furious when Ontario schools closed to in-person learning in January yet again. Protest is to be expected, and everyone has the right to peaceful protest, but that right does not extend to blocking highways and bridges. It doesn't extend to the intimidation, harassment, threats, and the endless and deafening noise we've seen in our national capital. These are crimes, and they are quite obviously crimes. We can't paint every protester with the same brush, but we can judge people by the company they keep. And we should never platform the language of treason, medical experiments, the Nuremberg Code, or support for white supremacy, all of which we saw on our democracy's doorstep. My genuine plea to those listening, to those who dislike the Prime Minister, who dislike public health measures, to those who sit in the Conservative caucus especially, just remember that democracies are fragile. Encouraging lawlessness and emboldening anti-government, anti-democratic voices does a disservice to our country, no matter how much hatred you have for your opponents. If you don't stop fanning the flames, I'm not certain we'll be able to put out the fire. And reflecting on my own side of the House, if we are so fearful of polarization, then we ought to be especially careful not to contribute to it ourselves. We are each sent here to represent our constituents, yes, of course, but our obligations extend beyond any parochial interest. We are the trustees of our democracy, the rule of law, civil liberties, and peace, order, and good government. The illegal blockades represented an attack on these core ideas. The greatest criticism of how the blockades were removed is that they were not removed more quickly. The failure to enforce the law in Ottawa, the acquiescence to occupation, emboldened similar blockades across the country, Emerson, Coutts, the Ambassador Bridge. Against a failed municipal and provincial response, a strong federal response was warranted. So I suffer no sympathy for those who shut down our border crossings and inflicted harm on the residents of Ottawa. But in the interest of disappointing everyone in my audience, I do have concerns with the invocation of the Emergencies Act in the circumstances. One constituent I trust a great deal wrote to me that extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. She's unquestionably right. But the law also remains the law. So let's turn to it for a moment. Section 16 of the Act defines a public order emergency as an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada and that is so serious as to be a national emergency. The shoe arguably fits with this general definition in mind, but the Act goes on to define two terms with great specificity. First, and again in keeping with Section 16, threats to the security of Canada has the meaning assigned by Section 2 of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act. And in turning to that CSIS Act, we see four possible meanings: espionage, foreign influenced activities, activities akin to terrorism, the violent overthrow of the government. These are incredibly high standards. In the OIC, the government relies on activities akin to terrorism. Or, as the Minister of Justice said in the House, we took measures that had been applied to terrorism and applied them to other illegal activity. The specific section requires there be activities in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective. It's obvious enough that the latter element is met, as warped as the ideological objectives may be. But have there been threats or acts of serious violence that themselves amount to a national emergency? We know that dangerous and extremist elements are embedded within these protests and blockades. In Coutts, for example, we saw conspiracy to commit murder charges, with two of the accused connected to a far-right extremist group. We also saw the police seize a cache of guns and body armor, and in Ottawa, we saw major intimidation of local residents and threats against the police if they enforced the law. As a parliamentarian, I acknowledge I'm not privy to all of the information in the hands of the executive, and there may well be even more dangerous and coordinated elements at play. But it also strikes me that these serious threats are ancillary to the blockades, and it is the blockades that constituted the emergency. A national emergency, after all, is also a defined term within the Act. It means an urgent and critical situation of a temporary nature that either seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is beyond the capacity and authority of a province to deal with it, or seriously threatens Canada's ability to preserve its sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. There's an additional requirement that no other federal law be sufficient to meet the emergency as well. It's frustrating that the government has not clearly articulated which ground it relies on here, and it appears they'd like to rely on both. When we look at the illegal blockades and the negative impact they wrought on so many lives, I do think there's a fair argument that they meet the definition of a national emergency. So long as we understand capacity to mean both whether a province could act in theory, as well as the reality of their action. But again, it's the blockades at issue. When we look at the threats of serious violence, the violence that must itself constitute the national emergency at issue, it's unclear how the definition is met. To meet the Act's requirements, it seems apparent to me that we need to reinterpret serious violence to persons or property to mean economic harm. I'm often in support of large and liberal interpretations of the law, but I'm not convinced we want economic harm to trigger the Act unless we'd be comfortable with the Act being used in other instances of economic harm. The most recent one in memory being the railway blockades in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en. This is all perhaps too lawyerly, too technical an objection. Other levels of government had failed to act or acted too slowly. Legal gaps certainly exist in addressing foreign funding and influence operations, crowdfunding for illegal domestic activities, and the emergency measures seem to have worked. It's also true, as I say, that I don't have all of the intelligence information that the executive has. My answer to that is a simple one, and I know many will find it inadequate, but contorting the application of the law in order to defend the rule of law is not a position I find comfort in. Expert Wesley Wark wrote recently that the Emergencies Act was unusable because of the high threshold in Section 2 of the CSIS Act. But he subsequently came around to the idea of shoehorning the law to fit because of his perception of the nature of the threat and the missing response from other levels of government. Expert Leah West recently wrote, "As someone who fervently believes in the rule of law, I'm desolated by what we've witnessed this month. A failure to enforce the law by two levels of government created a crisis that the third had to contort the law to end." A fair summation. Now, whatever one thinks of the legal contortion, and the ends may well justify the means and the courts will weigh in on the law, let's return to the role of Parliament. In the coming months, we will need to address the shortcomings in the laws, perhaps to better protect critical infrastructure, and most certainly to better follow the money of foreign influence operations and crowdfunding for illegal activities, but with proper due process. Assuming the threshold question is met here, it is still not at all clear to me that the government continues to need the ability to freeze bank accounts without due process, if it ever did. Usefulness and effectiveness are very different standards as compared with necessity and proportionality. Now, where does it leave us for tonight's vote on the invocation of the Emergencies Act and Section 58? Putting aside my concerns around the threshold or due process, the effect of Section 58 is that a yay vote extends emergency measures, while a nay vote simply revokes the powers as of the day of the negative vote. A nay vote need not mean impugning the actions of the government over the last week. Whatever one thinks of the necessity and proportionality of the emergency powers at the time they were invoked, whatever one thinks of the threshold that triggers the act in the first place, the question before us is whether the powers remain necessary and proportionate to the circumstances today. I appreciate the federal leadership over the last week, and this is not the War Measures Act, as this particular legislation highlights the role of the Charter and provides for a significant amount of independent and parliamentary scrutiny. But I'm skeptical that the strict legal test was met for the Act's invocation, and I'm not convinced that the emergency measures should continue to exist beyond today. I would vote accordingly, but for the fact that it is now a confidence vote, and the disagreement I've expressed here does not amount to non-confidence, and I have no interest in an election at this time. Thanks, Madam Speaker.
So before I go to questions and comments, I do want to remind members not to be debating and chatting across the way while another member has the floor. It's very rude and not very parliamentary. The honourable member for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. The former Speaker, who I respect and esteem greatly, was mistaken in one respect. He said that he would disappoint everybody. He has not disappointed me. His analysis, I think, is accurate. The actions were unlawful. It was appropriate to end the blockades. He also correctly states, was perhaps not necessary to use the Emergencies Act, and he is entirely correct that if we vote no tonight, this will end the Emergencies Act and the legal emergency effectively instantly without invalidating necessarily that which was done before. I believe I'm also right, and here I'm asking for his, he's obviously looked into this. I believe I'm right that all of the other things that take place under the Act, including a review of the actions over the course of the next year, would take place if there is a no vote tonight. Is that in fact correct? Thank you.
The honourable member for Beaches East York.
He is correct, and to be honest, it is those additional measures that actually do give me greater comfort. So when we see that there's a parliamentary committee that will be struck, when we see that there's an inquiry, when we know that 20 members of parliament or 10 senators can call for a revocation before the end of the 30-day cycle, and we could have a vote on that, and I would hope that the government is itself deeply scrutinizing the usefulness and necessity of these measures as they go forward. And I don't see that these measures are going to need to continue to exist for the full 30 days. So whether it is an act of Parliament or an act of the government, we will see. But I would just emphasize that the measures he's highlighted there are incredibly important, and they do give me comfort.
The honourable member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have great esteem for my colleague. He has not disappointed me with his speech. He's always so thoughtful and conducts an independent analysis of the situation, and I find that very honourable. I admire that. I have a question about his comments earlier. Well, I would like to first make a comment. Does my colleague not agree with the fact that if the crisis had been better managed from the beginning, regardless of what level of government was involved? Well, what I'd like to know is in terms of the confidence vote, rather, on the Emergencies Act. Does he not think that making this a confidence vote, is it not undermining somewhat the validity of the exercise of democracy that we do in this House? It's kind of twisting the arm of members who may have a divergent opinion. Thank you. The honourable member for Beaches East York.
In 2015, we ran on a platform to encourage freer votes in the House of Commons, and that platform included effectively saying there would be free votes, but for 3 issues: platform commitments, human rights or charter-related issues, and confidence votes, including budget considerations. It wasn't only budget considerations, though. My reading of our parliamentary history is that it is well within the right of the executive, well within the right of the government to declare this a confidence vote, and I will obviously abide by that. And to the members' previous comments around the failure of other levels of government, absolutely, this was a matter that needed federal leadership because of the failure, and as I say, the federal government showed that leadership.
Questions and comments? Time for a brief question. The honourable member for Nunavut.
To the member for Beaches East York. Yesterday, there was news that demonstrators met in locations in Vancouver, Chilliwack, and the Pacific Highway border crossing in Surrey, BC, that was closed and required reopening because of the demonstrators. Would you agree that this is evidence of foreign interference requiring national oversight from us as parliamentarians?
Okay, just a reminder to the honourable member that she's to address questions and comments to the chair and not directly to the member. The honourable member for Beaches East York, a brief answer.
So the 4 branches in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, there is reference to foreign influence. It's generally understood to be state-sponsored foreign influence. I do think we ought to be wary of and perhaps have permanent rules with proper due process to address that issue going forward. I don't think we want to address that issue, which isn't going to go away tomorrow or within 30 days. I think we want more permanent facing rules that are firmer and that have proper due process.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for...
The honourable member for Lévis-Lobinière. Today, Madam Speaker,
Madam
Speaker, I participate in this debate on the Emergencies Act with a great deal of nostalgia. I remember arriving in the Canadian Parliament in February 2006, bright-eyed, hopeful. This Parliament represented for me the best of everything: freedom, democracy, and respect of one another. Here, on the lawn in front of the Peace Tower in the spring of 2006, you could see young children playing soccer, teenagers playing frisbee, and young couples in love holding hands. Canada was a peaceful country.
Canada was a peaceful country, and the Canadian country had confidence in that.
Conservateur, avec un leader fort sous la direction du très honorable Stephen Harper, et toute une équipe talentueuse et déterminée à rendre ce pays plus stable, fort et uni.
We seem to have a problem with the interpretation. We'll try again. Can you let me know if it's working? Is there interpretation right now? Yes? All right. The Honourable Member. A government that took responsibility and worked hard every day for the well-being of all Canadians. Our country was a place of security where people trusted the government and where all hope was permitted. Our country was the envy of the whole world. It was a place filled with promise, with opportunity, and with a dream to see our children and grandchildren prosper and make a good living. Madam Speaker, it's now 2022, and I no longer recognize my country, my Canada. Madam Speaker, since the Liberal Party has come to power, Canadians and Quebecers are tired, they're stressed out, and they're disillusioned. They have lost confidence in this clumsy and intransigent government, where the respect and the defense of fundamental rights leaves much to be desired. They are experiencing a collective sense of disappointment with the situation that we are all living right now. An Emergencies Act for Canadians who only asked to speak with the Prime Minister. Proud, patriotic Canadians who were worried about their future. All they wanted was a frank discussion and the tabling of a well-defined plan. That would have made all the difference. All that these Canadians were looking for was proof of leadership. They wanted to feel like there was a captain at the helm of their country. These are people who travel the roads of our country day and night, all year long, transporting food and essential goods for the well-being of all. And they needed the support of their government. Madam Speaker, this government has gone from one blunder to another. And because of that, we're all living in a climate of widespread uncertainty. This has been a very difficult winter, and we don't know what to expect with this coming spring. What will the summer bring? And what will happen this fall with the pandemic? Well, I hope for a return of hope. Hope that the Conservative team, with new leadership, will be ready to replace this ineffective government, a government that is incompetent and that is worn out to the bone. Madam Speaker, this weekend we are turning a dark page in our history. How can we explain to future generations? How can I explain what's happening to my 5 grandchildren, my little Maeva, little Beatrice, my little Loic, my little Delphine, and my little Arthur? How can I explain to them that women and men of goodwill, but through excess of despair and have been displaced by intimidation and violence right here in the heart of our usually democratic and peaceful country? Madam Speaker, this is not the Canada that I want to leave to my grandchildren. There are no winners. We are all losers today. Madam Speaker, I know that all is not lost. We still have hope, and we still have the strength to recover from these crises. And also from the unforeseen events that are still to come. Canadians, from coast to coast to coast to coast, are going through a difficult time, and if we work hard, we'll come out of it stronger, more united, and more ambitious. I think, for example, of our Olympic athletes who have made us proud over the last 2 weeks. I think also of all the Canadians who work hard in our healthcare system, who go above and beyond for their families, for a better life. I also think of all the opportunities that we have here in Canada, the opportunities to stand out and to succeed. We have to remain optimistic. Let's be strong. Let's all stand together to build the Canada of tomorrow and meet all of the challenges and obstacles in our way. And we will also be able to overcome the inevitable consequences that will catch up sooner or later of this Liberal government that made all the wrong choices. Madam Speaker, together we have everything that we need to regain our confidence, to prove to ourselves that anything is possible. We have what it takes to heal our wounds, to regain the strength and determination that is the hallmark of all those who live in this country and defend our freedoms in this great and beautiful country, Canada. From this day forward, all of us here in this House, we must commit to ensuring that history does not repeat itself. We must make a commitment to have discussions and explain to our constituents how we can move forward with our future societal projects, how we can work together to restore a sense of trust in our elected officials. We need to continue working to restore faith in the future through simple gestures like listening to people and showing empathy. Madam Speaker, we have the duty to talk to each other, to respect to each other, and to understand each other. Madam Speaker, in the last few days, I've received many emails and phone calls from Canadians who have asked me to carry their voice to this Parliament to make things happen, as they say. I felt their impatience, and I feel the responsibility of the trust they have placed in me to represent them. I thank all of them for their kind words and for their inspiring and well-thought advice. Madam Speaker, I hold the torch to represent my constituents in all humility, and I will try to make their lives better this year. Madam Speaker, I've obviously told you how much hope I have, but I have many concerns about what will happen under the current government. Believe me, I'm a man of faith and conviction, but I also know how to be realistic, like all Canadians who are not fools. Since 2015, with this elected Liberal government, which might have responded to the debate for a certain need for freedom, to a desire for renewed feminism, and to new possibilities, with the freedom to smoke pot, to be whoever you want and however you want. Well, despite all that, we have to admit that we are now witnessing the consequences of the Liberal debacle. The experts will tell us later, but right now we have a whole generation that has lost its foundation, its roots, and its social identity. By living our differences to the fullest, I unfortunately see that we have lost our unity, our common sense of duty, of sharing, of consideration for the needs of the most vulnerable in our communities. What the pandemic crisis has shown us, in many ways, is that, unfortunately, many have abandoned their roots and those who gave birth to them. And that's very sad, Madam Speaker. But there's worse, Madam Speaker. There are those who have no idea what's going on, and those who pretend not to know, because many are afraid to imagine what will happen when this Liberal Party legalizes hard drugs and prostitution as promised in their platform. Many try to give themselves a clear conscience by saying that we will know what our children and grandchildren are taking, that girls and women will be treated better, but the reality on the street will not have changed on the black market. We will see a society that will have more and more mental health challenges and greater challenges with crime, as the two often go hand in hand. Episodes of violence are to be expected, and what we're experiencing, as we're managed by a clown, and forgive me the expression, Madam Speaker, is really the precedent for what may lie ahead. Madam Speaker, when I'm in my part of the country, I am able to enjoy life to the fullest, but I can't have peace of mind when I know that many people will suffer from the disastrous choices of this Prime Minister and all his cronies, who will get their feet greased with his immoral policies. Madam Speaker, we were born free. We were in a free country, a country that was economically prosperous. The honourable member will have time to finish his speech during questions and comments.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kills.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. What a change. I'm wondering, through you, if the member listened to the speech this morning by the honourable member from Parry Sound, Muskoka. My goodness, what a change in tone, and not for the better.
The honourable member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Thank you, Madam Speaker. This will allow me maybe to finish with the last paragraph of my speech. We were born free. We were in a free country, economically prosperous, and with the Liberal Party, we're now trapped in a fearful image in what was once a land of opportunity and a country recognized worldwide as a leader in every field. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to react to my colleague's speech because I think it's important to note at this point that I would like to express that I disagree with many of the elements that he mentioned in his speech, despite the fact that we will likely vote in the same way on the government's motion for the Emergencies Act. And so maybe I would like to ask my colleague explain further, because my perception is that people across the street who were protesting, there were some who were there for legitimate reasons, but there were many there who weren't choir boys, if you will. So I'm trying to understand, because in his speech I got the impression that for him, these are extraordinary people. So I'd like to understand his position, but also it's important to understand that we're talking about an Emergencies Act, and I didn't hear him talk about the Emergencies Act in his speech. I think this is a very serious situation, so I'd like to know, I didn't go walk around in the street with a Canadian flag in my hands, but I'd like to know what he thinks about the Emergencies Act. The honourable member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question, and I'd like to send him the following message. Everything changes. All things must pass. We have to stand strong and free. We have to support each other. We have to help those who need it the most. We have to share our strengths and weaknesses. We have to accept with dignity the hardships that we face, and we have to spread joy, peace, and love all around us. It's up to each of us to make a difference, and may these good words give us all hope and peace of mind in a better future for Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments.
The honourable member for King Vaughan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thank you to my colleague for a very well-deserved speech. I want to ask one question and make a comment. Coming from the corporate world, we always sat down with our customers and created focus groups to understand what it was their needs were. I'd like to hear why this government, and from him, could not do the same and negotiate with the truckers to come to a peaceful resolution.
The honourable member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Thank you, Madam Speaker. That's an excellent question. I've been asking it every day. If the Prime Minister had accepted from the very beginning to meet with those who were before in front of Parliament, then maybe we would never have had to go through everything that we've gone through over the last few weeks. That's all they were asking for, to speak to the Prime Minister. It was possible to have a meeting with the leaders. Thank you, Madam Speaker.